In July 2018, the body of a 13-year-old girl was found in Woodland in Southampton, England. She'd been stabbed over 20 times in a brutal execution-style attack. The police investigation that followed not only found the perpetrator had been living under the same roof as the victim, it also uncovered a year of abuse and sexual exploitation leading up to the killing. This is what happens when a predatory is unwittingly invited into the home of a vulnerable child. This is the murder of Lucy McHugh. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me. The case I'm going to cover today, I've been asked to comment on, I've been in documentaries about, but I've never believed that I've paid the attention that is required to this case. And like a lot of the things that I've done on my channel, I've gone back over cases that I've been on TV with, and I've done the story my way because I get to do it diligently, I deep dive, and I get the facts. And you would be amazed at how often TV fails to get the correct facts. So I am going back and making sure that any things that may have been incorrectly done in those particular programs are rectified here. Today's case is one of those that just makes you feel unbelievably sad because it just reminds us that it doesn't matter who we are, there are predators everywhere. And if one of those predators happens to groom you or groom your family, then because they're such mass manipulators, it's one of those things that you can fall prey to. That's one of the most challenging things about predators. They often look either normal, or they're people who are with your friendship group, or they're individuals within your family. And of course, that means that you are at risk. So in 2017, we have Lucy McHugh, this gorgeous, really happy, bubbly, outgoing 12-year-old. We're talking about a 12-year-old here. She's living with her mum, 30-year-old Stacey White. She's also got her stepfather with them, Stacey's partner, who's 22-year-old Richard Elms. Also living in the house is her younger brother, that's 11-year-old Dylan, and this is in the family home in Southampton. Now, the family, they had a nickname for her. They used to call her Brains because Lucy was really, really quick. She was really bright, and her mother said that she was like an elastic band. She could never sit still. And when she was interviewed after her daughter went missing, and she at length described the feelings that she had about being so distressed about what she was facing, she very much related to Lucy as this absolute live wire that was charismatic and very effervescent in her nature. And for Lucy, that life should have continued, pure and simple. But instead it changes forever in May 2017, because this is when Richard's childhood friend moves into the property. And you can understand, Richard's 22, so he's going to have lots of young friends, young people around him. And sometimes younger adults have issues socially, they have issues in the family network, and that can lead to problems where homelessness is concerned, or at least that can lead to some problematic conflict in their family. That can mean they want to look at moving on. And essentially for Stephen Nicholson, Richard provides a perfect opportunity that they allow him to move into their property and to essentially become an extended part of their family. Now, Stephen Nicholson, he's this part-time tattoo artist, but he's also got this really violent criminal past. And bear in mind, we're talking about a 23-year-old man, not talking about a 50-year-old. When you're 23 and you've had a very violent past, that is not predicting a positive future. The reality is that our past behaviour predicts, on average, our future behaviour. And yes, people do change, and certainly even in the violent population, offender-wise, there are changes that occur, particularly as people get a lot older, because people get bored or psychologically find new ways of managing their pain and their feelings and their aggression. But certainly when there's no distance between those kind of actions and who that person is right now, that's a big red flag. Because it isn't enough that we already know that this guy is somebody with a violent past who's criminalised, we can additionalise this with, as a really unhealthy interest in underage girls. And that is enormously concerning when you think about the fact I've described him moving in to a home with a very young girl in it. Clearly, that puts her at risk immediately. Now, when we look at Nicholson's criminal behaviour, that dates back to 2009. So when he's 14, we're seeing this really problematic behaviour arrive. And what happened at that point saw him sentenced to 3 years detention. So we had this 3 years detention and training order that was given to him. That's in a Young Offenders Institute, and it was for 2 separate incidents. So the first incident occurred in December 2009. Now, this is when he's living in a children's home. So of course we can have some empathy and sympathy. It's not ideal for a child to be living in the care sector, not in a children's home at least, because obviously it means that you don't have a secure attachment, and essentially the bonds that you have with your nearest and dearest probably aren't fused in a way that are that positive. So at this point we can see there's a level of dysfunction, and also his behaviour is problematic, which means that there is a strong likelihood he's ended up in care because his mother can't cope with him, for example. Now, on this particular day, he returns back to the home. It's late at night and he's under the influence of amphetamines. Now, in that situation, we appreciate that if you add amphetamines and other drugs to any scenario, there can be a behavioural shift. And we don't always act brilliantly under the influence of drugs or under the influence of alcohol. But it's not like the average child of this age would think, you know what I'm going to do now I'm under the influence? I'm going to take staff members and other child residents hostage. That one isn't something that's very common at all. In fact, I think in all the cases that I've covered, there hasn't actually been one yet that involved care staff being taken hostage, because it is so atypical. But this is what he does, and he threatens them with knives. He actually held that knife to one of the female staff members' throats. This is a high-level violent offence. Now, after he locks the hostages in a room, he then stole £1,000 from a safe. Now, this means that there's a level of premeditation to the attack. He knows what he wants, £1,000 from the safe, and he knows how to get it by basically threatening staff and taking children hostage. And like I said, at 14 years of age, this is really atypical. This is really escalating behaviours that are unusual in this kind of age frame. Then, after he's done that, he actually flees the scene in a car that belongs to one of the members of staff. And obviously, it doesn't take long for the police to apprehend him because he's not the brightest tool in the box, but it shows a real malevolence, doesn't it, within his nature? It shows a real dark streak. And I am the first person to say that it is possible for young people to change. I used to run projects for young people who had been criminalised. That was what I did. So I am well aware of the beauty that runs in the veins of many of those teenagers and the possibility and potential when they're offered the right environments. But I have also worked with those who, no matter what, where, how, or when you offered them A, B, C, or D, it would not change. There is something about their nature, and that nature is almost preset, almost predetermined. And I feel like we're dealing with that kind of character right now. Now, when he's apprehended by the police, he actually goes ahead and said that when he was carrying out the crime, he felt a real sense of power. Again, deeply disturbing, because this is an individual who's emotionally able to connect with the way it felt to carry out that offence in a positive way. So as opposed to being remorseful about one's actions or horrified by one's actions, not for him. For him, it's a sense of power. And if you're feeling that 14 years of age in this kind of high-level attack, that doesn't speak positively about your future potential. In fact, it's predicting future violent behaviour. So on the 16th of April 2010, he ends up getting jailed for false imprisonment, affray, possession of a knife in a public place, theft, damage to property, aggravated vehicle taking, and a driving offence. Just think about that in context with his age. And it's not as if this changed his behaviour when he actually got sent down, because it carries on after his incarceration. So we have him and 2 other inmates. They end up barricading themselves inside the canteen and they cause thousands of pounds of damage. They attack staff. They actually attempt to stab 1 prison guard with a knife. Luckily for that prison guard, he was wearing body armour, but it would have ended very differently had he not been. So these early incidents, we're seeing an indication of current violent behaviour, but also a precedent for Nicholson, because this is an individual who isn't just using his fists for violence, he's using knives. He's got a connection with knives. That's his particular MO, so to speak. That's what he likes to use to effect threat and obviously to effect gain when it comes down to his prior crimes. So we have this man moving in to Lucy's mother's home and essentially being offered this respite there. And he is a horrific human being. Now, I doubt that Lucy's mother had any idea about the form of this individual, because these kind of manipulators are excellent. And believe me, the one thing that we're going to talk about where Nicholson is concerned is he is a very big manipulator. So it's very easy to put on a mask and play a role. And arguably, I imagine immediately when he moves in, he's going to be charming. Now, Lucy's mother and partner, they are very kind at this moment in time to let this guy move into the family home. This is May 2017. Lucy is just 12 at this point. And the reason I say there is a kindliness about this is because clearly they are wanting what's best for Nicholson, because Lucy's mother even gets him a job. It's as a care worker for the elderly. That's where she worked. How on earth he got that, I have got no idea. I can only imagine the DBS, the police checks I'm talking about here, the historical checks to note whether somebody is safe to be around individuals, that they mustn't have been very effective, because this man should not be within 100 meters of a vulnerable person. But nonetheless, he gets a job as a care worker, and we all know that care workers are often underpaid and overworked, and the consequence of that is that there is a high turnover of staff, and that can mean that maybe some of the checks that should have occurred didn't occur. But essentially, like I say, Nicholson should not be working with anybody vulnerable, end of, because of his prior convictions and behaviour. Now, before he moved in to Lucy's mother's, Nicholson had been living with his own mum, quite nearby, but they'd fallen out. They hadn't been getting on. I imagine that his behaviour was, shall we just say, pretty reprehensible, because in this case, a leopard ain't changing his spots. So when he moves, he's arrogant as far as I'm concerned. So if you are offered the opportunity to move into somebody else's home and they give you the good grace of allowing you space, then you are going to be very, very careful about what you bring into the home, because at the end of the day, it is their space, not yours. Not this guy. He brings with him a collection of pets. This includes a tarantula, 2 chameleons, pythons, and a 9-foot boa constrictor. I kid you not. Literally. I did say that. A tarantula, 2 chameleons, pythons, and a 9-foot boa constrictor. The only thing that's sad in this story is that 9-foot boa constrictor did not at some point manage to constrict his neck during the night at some point. And when he came round, it had constricted it so much that he couldn't shout for help. That would have been a really great end to this particular story, but it's not, of course. And you've got to think about the kind of superiority that you've got there and arrogance that you think that that's acceptable to just bring all these animals into a home of a working family, essentially. I mean, for me, he's literally the least perfect living companion you could meet. But for him, this isn't just the perfect living arrangement because he can bring all of his animals and belongings. It's also brilliant for him because he can use the property as a base for his work as a tattoo artist. Also, he can sell cannabis from the home. And on top of this, and probably the worst part of all, is there is another part of the arrangement that's just absolutely ideal for him. Because as well as being this horrific, violent criminal, Nicholson was a predatory paedophile. His interests lay in very young girls. And his bedroom, well, that's now opposite 12-year-old Lucy's room. She is literally the perfect victim for Nicholson, because not only is she available, she's there in the house, and we know what these predators look for, people who are available and vulnerable, and she's absolutely at a very vulnerable age. And like so many prepubescent, pubescent young girls before her, she starts to develop this crush on Nicholson. He's a tattoo artist, he looks pretty cool as far as she's concerned. He's got all these weird and wonderful pets. He'll seem older, more mature, but obviously groomers always take time to engage with their victim and build a relationship and make them feel special and all the things that we know these kind of absolute loser, not right human excuses do to ensure that they get a grip on the thing that they want to get a grip on. And of course, as a young girl, she starts to develop this crush on Nicholson. Now, whilst most adults, when a kid gets a crush on you, and it happens, teachers go through it all the time, sports coaches go through it all the time, scout leaders, guide leaders, etc. When you're around kids, there will always be one child who falls in love with you to some degree, not in a sexual way by any stretch of the imagination, but just because you make them feel better. You make them feel that they stand out, they've got a little bit of visibility, and it's where we have a practice ground for our future relationships. So many of us will remember a teacher in school that we genuinely started to feel that we fancied, even though they were like 38, 40 when we're 13 years of age. But it's a safe mechanism for practicing those feelings without any intent or result. And that's the important thing here. The adults are meant to have boundaries. An adult can find out that a child finds them attractive and is interested in them in a cute and endearing way, and they'll find it cute and endearing, and they will know that what you do with that child is you handle them sensitively and compassionately, and you show them clear boundaries, and you teach them that adults are good, that adults can understand right from wrong. But unfortunately, these children sometimes come across an individual who doesn't have those boundaries, who doesn't see it as cute and endearing. They see it as an opportunity. They see it as the perfect situation where they can play out their dark sexual fantasies in the most inappropriate of places. And that's what Nicholson does. He sees this as an opportunity. And instead of letting her see that whilst she's sweet, whilst she's lovely, whilst he's flattered that it's an absolute no because of the age frame and boundaries, he instead actively encouraged it. In fact, he goes further, he pursues her. So he sees her as this sexually available and easy target. And we have to all remember that when you're 12 or 13 years of age, often those feelings can be so intense. They feel so real. When you feel these emotional connections with people older than you, and even if you know that that means that it's not an appropriate relationship, you're dealing with the burning experience of feeling connection and lust and love. And it's meant to be left there because you're not in a space where you can consciously understand what that would mean or consent to that kind of behavior because of your age. And this is what makes you so vulnerable as a young person, because all of the feelings that you're having, they feel absolutely real, and they are real. It's just that you're not in the psychological place where you have the capacity to consent. You feel it, but that's why you need to be protected. And these predators, these child molesters, they know that young people have these feelings. And instead of them protecting them from those feelings and being clear that whilst those feelings are normal and natural, that they're too young to act on them or to have those acted on by somebody else, predators see this as the perfect opportunity. And that's what he does. He presents, creates, and pursues this opportunity that he should be running so fast from. The only thing you'd see is dust, genuinely. Now, on top of the fact that she's vulnerable because of her age, she's vulnerable because of her feelings, she's certainly vulnerable because of the fact that he's very near to her and she's available in that way because they're living under the same roof. She's also vulnerable because she has some mental health problems, and she was actually receiving treatment at the time. She'd also been diagnosed with ADHD. So there was a lot going on in her emotional, psychological, personal and physical life. Now, the same month that Nicholson takes advantage, essentially, of moving into that home, of interrupting a family unit, of bringing all these animals into the environment. That same month he manages to manipulate that to fruition, Lucy loses her virginity to him. And even though what we're really talking about there is rape, I'm putting it in the context of how Lucy would be viewing it. So we all appreciate she cannot consent. This is rape, end of. This is a exploited child by a predatory paedophile. We've got to understand the psychology of Lucy, and Lucy isn't seeing herself in that moment this way. That's why these kind of predators are so disgusting, disgraceful, and so clever. These victims often feel that they have a level of responsibility, that they actually have an alliance with this person, that they're actually in a loving relationship. And that's what is so utterly disgraceful about these kind of predators, because they use the innocence and the childlike qualities and the lack of experience of these kids against them. And you write it in your diary because at the end of the day, you have an inkling that you shouldn't be doing it, that if people found out there might be a problem, the person's likely telling you that nobody should know about this, it's got to be your secret. And yet you're full of all these new emotions and you've got confusion and questions. And so you go to your diary to just cathartically express yourself. And in that diary, there are multiple descriptions of sexual encounters between them. Now, in the UK, because it won't be the same all over the world, the age of consent is 16. Now, sexual activity with a child 12 or under, that's deemed as statutory rape. Now, regardless of whether a child is saying, oh yes, I want this, because bear in mind, the coercion that's involved in these kind of relationships makes a child sometimes feel that this is something that they also want, because sex can feel good. And being physically intimate with another person can feel like an attention that you want, and you don't understand the consequences, and you don't understand the level of conscience required to actually go ahead and engage in that kind of intimate relationship. You don't understand the ramifications of having sex that young. The reason that in the UK we have it as statutory rape is because we do not believe that consent exists. The child is literally incapable of consenting, no matter what their feelings are. So what she's noting in her diary, where Nicholson is concerned, is that he is committing multiple statutory rapes. And it's all there, it's all documented. Now, despite the fact that Lucy is only 12 at the time, clearly and evidently she knows that what's happening is wrong. And this is heartbreaking, because so many children who are being sexually abused, they genuinely know that it isn't something that should be happening, but they don't quite know how to deconstruct it. They don't know how to move past it, and don't know how to let it go sometimes, because it can be that the one person in the world is paying them attention and all of a sudden they feel visible and special. And knowing how to break that off and to lose that quality of feeling visible and special, it's really psychologically challenging. And that's what is another expression as to her age and naivety, because clearly she's feeling those conflicts and she hasn't got the age or the understanding and wisdom to know how to deconstruct it and to remove him from her world. So one of the entries actually says that whatever this was between them had to end. So she's even noting that down. And what's really sad is it didn't end, not in the way that any of us would wish for it to end. Now, Lucy can't keep it in like so many young people. She's in what she considers a relationship with Nicholson. So she isn't seeing herself as a victim, even though she 100% is a victim. And it gets to a point where she feels that she wants to at least talk to some people close to her. So she actually starts to confide in her friends and lets them know that they are in this kind of intimate relationship. And of course, friends talk. And some friends will know that no matter how Lucy is describing this relationship, it is completely inappropriate. So teachers at her school find out about this. Then they pull Lucy in, of course they do, because they want to make sure on a safeguarding level, if this is happening, they act. At this point, she says, no, there's absolutely nothing happening. There's no sexual activity with Nicholson whatsoever. But school are worried. You know, this guy's living under the roof. They have to make sure that the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, and I love it when they actually take a multi-agency approach, and they do that. So they report their concerns to the multi-agency safeguarding hub in spite of her denying their relationship. Now, her mum, she's really unhappy with this. She's unhappy with that referral, and she's so unhappy that she basically arranges a transfer of schools. Now, on one level, a lot of people will look in and think, well, why? The school have done everything that they can in this moment in time to protect Lucy. They've highlighted that these rumours have been spread. They've felt that even though Lucy has denied it, there is a potential that she's denying it because she doesn't want him to get into trouble. And so the consequence is, to be safe rather than sorry, they get in contact with these services to ensure that they're aware of that, just in case. So they're future-proofing any problems. But I suppose one could say that her mother could believe that, as Lucy has said, this is all rubbish, and she wants a bias to believe that Lucy certainly isn't a victim of sexual abuse, that she decides that this is just a school making something up at a cost now to the services potentially getting involved with her family, which is something she potentially doesn't want. Either way, she does take what I would consider is a rather radical approach, and she transfers Lucy's schools. Now, even though Lucy does transfer to a new school, her new teachers, they also become concerned. And then they do exactly the same. They take this multidisciplinary approach, inform the services that they have these concerns. And despite these multiple reports, what I will say is that social services did apparently investigate, but they somehow found nothing of concern. And with respect, that becomes a fatal oversight. And again, I suppose for balance, what we can say is that social services only have a certain amount of powers. If they investigate and find that the home is a suitable home for a child, if everybody seems happy, if a child is denying that there's been any sexual inappropriateness, then to some degree their hands are tied. But it does make me wonder who was questioning Lucy, what the questions were being asked, and whether Lucy felt that she would get into trouble if she did in fact say that she was having this sexual relationship with this man. Because this is the thing about being a teenager and a young person. You often think that the responsibility will come down to you, and that people will be angry with you, and that somehow because you've been engaging in this sexual relationship, you bear responsibility. And that's, again, something that I find really, really difficult, because I've worked with so many children and so many young people and then so many survivors down the line, and that's their story. And in this case, it's a story that proves fatal. And it's one of those things where within me, I just have that feeling of Lucy deserved so much more. Now, Nicholson exploited that little girl, because she's a little girl, isn't she? She's just getting to the point of adolescence. She's not even there yet. And he's got this whole year just abusing her. And as the time passes, it's not as if this relationship is one where he's trying to be endearing and he's trying to be protective, all the while being a horrible child predator. But he's not being like that. He's not even doing the work to try to keep the relationship under wraps by being sweet and kind and an individual who's trying to, in his eyes, do the best for the girl that he's having sex with. Not at all. He's not even using that kind of predatory manipulation. And we see that a lot. It's why some people never come forward to talk about their abuser, because the abuser in their head, yes, was having sex with them at a highly inappropriate age, but they were also really nice and they bought them presents and they made them special. You know, that's one of the tactics that these manipulators use. But it's not with this guy. He starts being horrible to her and she's becoming really afraid of him. So when you look at her diary entries and also what she told her older cousin, because she confides in her older cousin about this, Nicholson's becoming really violent, really aggressive towards her. And one of the entries in the diary actually detailed how Nicholson had made her have sex and raped her. And also he choked her out during sex. This is a little girl, this is a child. And this man is raping her knowingly for Lucy. So again, everything we've talked about so far, she is being raped. She can't consent. But in her mindset, when she's writing this in her diary, even she is now seeing that she is being raped by him. This is harrowing, that this child has him living under her mother's roof, and he is taking full advantage of that under that roof in a place of sanctuary where she should be safe, and he's even choking her out during sex. And the thing about that is, a lot of people will talk about having sexual kinks. Choking is something that lots of people engage in. Personally, I think it's a really dangerous activity because everybody has different limits. And also, particularly when people are under the influence, it can lead to incredibly problematic outcomes. Women have died during this kind of sex. And even in court, excuses have been used because of that particular kink to allow the men who killed them to walk free. Because that's a whole heap of crazy, as we all know. But nonetheless, that happens. But the fact that he's actively choking a child, oh, could this guy get any more reprehensible? Could this man be any more disgraceful, disgusting, horrific? She also writes that there was another occasion where she actually had to lock herself in the bathroom to escape him. So that just demonstrates the level of violence. And bear in mind, let's just track back to when he basically kept people hostage and put a knife to the throat of the care worker and then did the same when he was dealing with a prison officer. This is an individual who likes the power and domination. So sexually, we're seeing that play in to the way that he's treating Lucy. And the fact that she's now barricading herself in the bathroom, and also she had to barricade herself in her own room because he came back in really drunk and high, and he just tried to get into her room at that point, which is terrifying. And I do, with respect, wonder why nobody was noticing that this was occurring. I genuinely do. But again, often people go to bed earlier, or maybe they're not in the environment, they're out at the time that this kind of attack is happening. But that must have been absolutely terrifying for Lucy. I can't imagine how she would feel knowing that there was nowhere to turn in that moment. She also told the friends that she was kind of having conversations with about this man that he slapped her. And it was known in the house, with respect, that they would constantly argue. So it was a frequent occurrence that Nicholson would fly into these rages. He would be known to actually scream in her face. He called her a cunt. And what I would say about that little firecracker of a girl, because bear in mind what we're talking about, this girl is a very young child. In spite of dealing with that kind of loser, that kind of violent, aggressive predator, she stood up to him. And she actually said to him that she had a hold over him and that it was his own fault. And she was right. And even though we all can see that that kind of veiled threat puts her in horrible danger, it's all she's got in that moment. It's a reminder. I'm maybe a kid, but I'm not stupid. And you may be a violent perpetrator who threatens me. But you know, I know things about you that if I decide to talk about those things with others, you'll be the one who's caged. I won't have to worry about you then. And that shows what a bright girl she is. Because in that moment of powerlessness and vulnerability, she's letting him know you're not as powerful as you believe. And whilst the consequences of this do not turn out as any of us would wish, we have to hold testament to that child's ability to fight back. It's an admirable quality. Now, what happens within all of these horrible fights that are going on, and this man who not only has brought all his pets, is abusing the girl in the house, and is also now being violently aggressive to her under her own roof, her parents get tired of it. So Lucy's mother and her step-parent, they get tired of the constant arguments. Now, whilst I do not want to disrespect Lucy's mother, she's lost enough, I do find it deeply questionable that anybody would let a person who doesn't belong to the family be abusive to a child from the family. I cannot wrap my head around why you would accept that kind of conflict. If you walked into my home and I had allowed you to stay an extended the grace of giving you a bed, and then you literally called my child a name in a row, I would pack your bags for you and push you out of my home. There's also been a change in family dynamics because they've had a new baby, and so they ask Nicholson to move out at this point. And that's come, again, as far as I'm concerned, a little bit too late, but at least now we have this opportunity to see Lucy's family reclaim their home. Now, even though he does actually move out, he ends up leaving his possessions and also his pets in the home, and he goes and stays at a friend's, which, as far as I'm concerned, means that he hasn't really left at all. I mean, if all your possessions and the animals that you own are still in situ at somebody else's house, it makes me feel like he was just intending to have a break, shall we say. And he did certainly have a real issue with being asked to leave. He's really unhappy with it. You know, as far as he's concerned, he's had a great thing going, hasn't he? He's been living in this house, he's probably been using their resources, his pets have had somewhere to live, and he'd had this option to just use this poor defenseless child whenever he fancied, and now Lucy has gone and ruined it, as far as he's concerned. You know, the fact that she is fighting back in these rows and it's escalated conflict, and now her mother is unhappy with that situation, has had to leave. He's projecting this. This is all on her. She's the problem. Now, on top of that, he's obviously starting to get concerned that she's going to disclose his paedophilic behaviour. And I think that concern was a correct one, because she's been dealing with the burden of this highly inappropriate, abusive relationship, and it's just become too much for her. And now he's actually out of the picture and she's not under constant threat. She realises that this has just been totally outside the realms of rational, and she's a victim. So she starts to want to open up to her mum about the abuse. She wants to inform her mother of exactly what's been going on under her roof. Now, the same day that Nicholson leaves, she actually tells Richard, who's obviously Nicholson's friend, he's the motivator for him coming initially, she tells him that, I want to tell my mum something. But what's really sad is one of those sliding doors moments that we see so often in these cases. And by the time that Stacey gets home, Lucy's already in bed. And obviously her mother's not going to wake her up. The reality is she might have no idea in that moment just how serious the issue was that Lucy wanted to confide in her. So this moment just passes. And unfortunately for Lucy's mother, she was never going to get another chance to have that conversation. And Lucy would never in this life get the chance to expose the truth about him. Now, all the while, bear in mind, Nicholson has been formulating a plan to deal with Lucy, because she's no longer this compliant, easy victim. Now, she's this obstacle in his life. She's a threat. She holds power over him, and he doesn't like that. This is a man who likes domination. This is a man who likes to be in control. This is a man who calls the shots. And the idea that this young kid could destroy him because of his own actions, but destroy him nonetheless, is too much for him. And we all know what these predators want to do with obstacles, don't we? They want to get rid of them. Now, because Lucy has confided in some friends, bear in mind, one of them has actually gone and spoken to their parents about her concerns, because her friend is in this situation that she can see is completely inappropriate. And I so respect kids that do that. I think it's really challenging, you know, when a friend confides in you and you want to do what's right by them and you're conflicted because they've told you in confidence, but you can just see that they need you to make that choice. They need you to go and have that difficult conversation. I think it's just so heroic of kids who do that. And that child who went and told her parents about it, that was somebody who's got pro-social behaviour just running through their veins. So she tells her parents, look, Lucy's got this boyfriend, and this boyfriend's 10 years older than her. So her parents, because they are good people, really good people, they actually do that really difficult thing. They go and relay these concerns to Lucy's mother. Now, what Lucy's mother did in that moment is highly regrettable. because she allegedly responded by claiming that Lucy was living in a fantasy land and that she needed to stop living in that fantasy land because there was a likelihood in the end it was going to get somebody in trouble. I really think that is a unbelievably terrible mistake to make. Everybody knows how I feel on this channel. If your child is suspected of being abused by someone and you get that information, you should take it very seriously. Certainly if your child has confided in another person and it's relayed to you that they have described a sexual relationship with somebody who's older, it should not concern you whether they are lying. It should concern you that this is going on in their head and you need to figure out whatever it is, whether it is truth, whether it is fiction, but you need to act, because 99% of the time it's truth anyway. And just disregarding it because you don't want to have to deal with the psychological pain of realizing that you invited somebody into their life and put them in danger. I appreciate she's probably overwhelmed by the idea that this could actually be happening, that rejecting it feels easier, but I think it's a massive oversight on her part. And when you've also had two schools be very concerned about the issue, then that recurrence of the same theme is something that should certainly provoke a reaction, as opposed to blaming the child for living in fantasy land. But I've also worked in this field long enough to know that that is not an unusual reaction. People genuinely don't want to believe that something bad is happening to the kid, and more than that, they think that if something was, you'd be the first person to know. So because that isn't the way it works, when the child is confiding to people outside of your unit, you just think, that's because they're lying. But like I said, in these situations, that's something horrific that her mother will have to live with for the rest of her life. And I think that we have to also note that Nicholson is an incredible manipulator, because he clearly had Lucy's mum Stacey fooled. She obviously sees him as somebody who isn't the type of individual who would ever be engaging in that kind of relationship with her daughter. But like I said, when it comes down to sexual abuse, we have to take the victim seriously. We just have to, even if we're hearing it from different areas, because the kids very rarely feel that it's okay to confide in somebody that they love, like a primary caregiver, because they feel that they might let them down. That's why teachers often other people will find out about it before the parent, because it's just too overwhelming for the child to speak that truth. So we get to Tuesday, the 24th of July 2018, and this is when Nicholson decides that he's going to get rid of his obstacle. He's going to put this plan into action that he's been formulating whilst feeling resentful about no longer having access to the house that he's been living in. This is the point where his rage is going to find a place to go. So he goes to work as usual, but he leaves in the afternoon. So he tells his employer that he's not feeling well, he's suffering sickness and diarrhea bug. Obviously that's going to mean that they want him to leave immediately. Who wants to catch one of those bugs? And because he works with elderly people, that protocol actually dictated that he wouldn't be able to be in work for 48 hours. And that gives him loads of time to carry out his plan. So he's really thinking this through. He's premeditated these actions. He's thought thoroughly about how to create some time and distance between work and him so that he can actually carry out this dastardly plan. Also, of course, he's now got a bit of an alibi because he's told work, oh, I'm really sick. So that can be something that can be used in the future to basically protect him, to provide that alibi. Now, when he leaves work, first of all, he cycles to a flat in Curzon Court on Dunkirk Road, that's in Southampton. Now, this belongs to an elderly man that he knew. And to be fair, it transpires that it was a property that he was very, very familiar with. And he ends up staying there for about 3 hours. And during the time that he's at that elderly man's house, he orders a pair of trainers, actually arranges them to be delivered the next day. Also, he actually finds some old clothes, and he's planning essentially to wear these the next day for this particular task and plan that he has in mind. So later that evening, Nicholson gets back in touch with Lucy, so they exchange these messages on Facebook Messenger, and he also sends messages the following morning. That's Wednesday the 25th of July 2018. Now, we don't know the nature of these conversations, sadly, because Nicholson later deleted them. And back then, at that time, There was no record of the messages retained by the social networking platform. So there'd only actually be a log that communications had occurred, but there was no detail as to what the exchanges had been about. But whatever was discussed, it was evidently all part of Nicholson's really sinister plan. And that plan begins by getting Lucy alone, where he wanted her. That's his key. He wants to have Lucy so that he can carry out whatever he desires, to make her pay for what, as far as he is concerned, she's done, and to make her pay for the power that he believes she holds over him. Now, at this point, I would imagine he just suggests that there's going to be some kind of reunion, potentially a reconciliation or an apology or a let's sort all of this out and be friends. But whatever it is, it works. So she is now obviously believing that they are going to get together and it's not going to be a negative outcome. We can tell that because she wouldn't be going otherwise. So that summer morning, he left his mother's house at 8:15 a.m. and he cycled to the flat Curzon Court. This is where he stays for about half an hour. Then at 9 a.m, he goes to a nearby Tesco Express. Now, the reason he does that is not because he needs to go and get a meal deal. It's because he's got it in his plan, and it's for one reason only. He wants to be captured on CCTV wearing clothes that are different to the ones he would shortly change into. And that's, again, as far as he is concerned, creating an alibi. Because, look, what I was wearing this day. So if I wasn't seen in these clothes at ABC, it clearly wasn't me. So the premeditation is there, very powerful. Now, bear in mind, Lucy has had this communication with Nicholson, and she obviously knows that she's going to be meeting him somewhere, so she leaves her home shortly before 9 a.m. She actually walks the half-hour journey to the outdoor sports centre, which is near to a flat on Curzon Road, and obviously that's the flat that Nicholson's recently left. And they actually catch her on CCTV making that journey to her destination. And that destination will be her final destination, sadly. At 9:30 a.m, she's again captured, walking past the Tesco Express, which is the same one that Nicholson had actually called into shortly before. And she's shown wearing a black jacket. She's got white sleeves, a white vest top, camouflage leggings, and black and white Jordan trainers. Even the clothes description is upsetting because you just think about a young kid, don't you? The way that she's actually wearing those clothes, you know, carefree, just going out of business, absolutely no idea of the malevolence that others hold within their souls. And she's also spotted by a woman who'd been walking a dog in the grounds of the sports centre. That was around 10 a.m. And at this point, she's actually heading towards the top cricket pitch, and that's the last time that Lucy's ever seen alive, sadly. But obviously people have noticed her. She stood out enough for people to note where she's going. Now, later the same day, Lucy's mum starts to get really worried because Lucy doesn't get home. Now, at this point, Nicholson, and this is again something that just demonstrates the darkness that runs through this man's veins, he actually expresses concern at her disappearance. And he even says to Stacey to stay positive and to keep her chin up. This is what he texted Stacey. I hope they find her safe. Police are good at the job and they will find her soon. There are so many reasons why I have included that text because, firstly, if you are a perpetrator who've done the most horrendous thing to a child and you have no conscience to the point where you can actually reassure a parent who has looked after you and who is looking for their much loved child, and you use that basically to hopefully connect the idea that you're a caring, compassionate person, so why could you ever be a suspect? Because that's one of the motivations there. But also the fact that he can give this false reassurance when he absolutely knows Lucy is never coming home again. She's never going to walk through those doors again. That mother is never going to wrap that child in her arms again, and he knows that fully. And he just tells her that the police are good at their job. And it's like, yeah, in this case, sweetheart, the police are going to be good at the job, and you should be really worried about that. because perpetrators should always fear good investigators, because guess what? You get brought to justice, sweetheart. So here we are, her mother's frantic, she doesn't know where she is, but at the other side of it, it's not out of character for Lucy to not tell her mum where she's going. We've all been young people, we've all done that, and even though it's horrific for our primary caregivers to go through that feeling that they have no idea where we are, whether we're alive or dead, it's not because we're malicious, it's just because we don't really think about the impact because we're a kid, because we haven't got the conscience as wisdom that we'll have in 20 years' time. But her mum's obviously trying to kind of deal with the panic and say to herself, you know, this has happened before, hopefully it'll be okay. Also, Lucy didn't have a phone on her, so she couldn't actually contact her either. But you can imagine just trying to hope that it's all going to be fine. You're just going to be really annoyed when they walk through the door and you're going to tell them how you've now aged 20 years and have got more grey hairs than ever, which is what happens when our loved kids don't realise the impact of their disappearance, even for minutes, has on our lives. But that's not what's going to happen. Lucy isn't going to be responsible for a few grey hairs in those moments that she wasn't in contact with her mother, because Lucy's never coming home. We get to Thursday the 26th of July 2018. This is almost 24 hours after Lucy had last been seen, and a dog walker makes the most horrific discovery. Deep in the foliage in the woods, at the side of the top cricket pitch that Lucy had last been seen walking towards, was Lucy's body, and she had been brutally murdered. She was 13 years of age when she lost her life. The pathologist would later establish that she'd been stabbed multiple times, most probably with a kitchen knife. Just imagine the agony, the horror of dying that way, stabbed repeatedly with a kitchen knife. And in total, she'd been cut and stabbed 27 times. And the places she was stabbed, mostly to her face and neck. Now, dehumanization takes place there. The eradication of the individual that you're killing. When you stab somebody mostly in their face and neck, you are literally eradicating their looks, who they are, and you're also stealing the opportunity for any loved person in their life to say goodbye to them without being left with that trauma of seeing what's happened in those final moments. It's barbaric beyond belief. She had defensive stab wounds to her arms and wrists, so she tried to protect herself, she tried to fight back. And the actual fatal wounds, there were a collection of 4 or 5 stab wounds. They were all to the right side of the neck, and her carotid artery had actually been severed. So as you will know, the carotid artery, if that is severed, you have catastrophic blood loss. And that's exactly what occurred. So it was very sudden and absolutely catastrophic because of that particular injury. So very quickly she'd have fallen unconscious, and very soon after she would have died. Now, they also noted that there was a slash wound right across her wrist, and they believe that the reason that that person who had killed her had actually inflicted that injury was because they were trying to make it look like she'd cut herself. I mean, what a ridiculous attempt to make it look like a suicide. It's ludicrous, it's pathetic, but it's also resonant of an individual who again believes that they are superior and that they can get away with anything, including murder. After Lucy's brutally slain body was discovered, the horrific news had to be delivered to Lucy's mother and her partner. Can you imagine that moment? Every parent has experienced an instant where suddenly their stomach feels like it's dropped through the floor, because you have this moment of realization that something bad has happened to your child. We've all been there. An accident, a child getting robbed or assaulted. Pretty much every parent watching this right now, you'll have encountered a moment like this, but it will have been okay. But imagine a moment where it's not okay, where you're told that your child has been literally, brutally murdered, and they're never coming back to you. Now, of course, Nicholson hears of the killing. We all know that he's done it, but he hears of it, as in people are starting to talk. And so he decides that what he's going to do, he's going to share in their grief and despair. So he actively, again, tries to use this comforting them in their grief as the guise when the true predator is literally in that space with her parents. Can you imagine that? Of course, Stacey and Richard have got no idea that he's the perpetrator. They've no idea that he's already burnt his own trainers. He's got rid of his phone. He's changed his Facebook password, all the while playing this role. It doesn't take long, of course, for the police, because Nicholson isn't bright. He's not forensically astute. He's not a consequential thinker. He believes he is. He's got around raping a girl for a year and has managed to stay outside the authorities' reach on that level. So therefore, why can't he get away with murder too? But he's nobody when it comes down to actually having the intelligence to evade this kind of capture. So on the 27th of July, it's a Friday, he gets arrested that evening. It's in 2018. It happens at Totton train station. It's just one day after the discovery of Lucy's body. And they take his Motorola phone immediately from him, because obviously this will be evidence. But then very quickly they're able to establish, hey, this is a new mobile phone. It had literally only been activated 24 hours earlier. Now, during the interview, what he says is, yeah, I did get rid of my old phone and I did delete my message. But the only reason that I'd done that is I wanted to deny any evidence of buying drugs. He said that he knew the police would want to speak to him because he was related to that family to some degree, he'd been living there, and he just didn't want to risk his own safety if any of his dealers were identified, which again is just absolutely ludicrous and stupidity personified in any kind of trying to cover your tracks, because the police are not interested in whether he has dealers that he's buying drugs from. The police are interested in figuring out what's happened to this child. So the fact that he's trying to create this other story to mitigate why he's acted in this way, it will literally go in one ear where the police are concerned and out of the other, just potentially leaving a massive stain of suspicion in their heads. He also refused to tell the police where he'd disposed of it. Now that's again going to alert them straight away. Hang on a minute, you're meant to be helping us in this investigation. If you've got nothing to hide, then we can find this phone. We're not going to be interested in the issues that you have between dealers. That's got nothing to do with this case. And they're going to become more and more certain that they are dealing with a very dangerous man. He also claimed that on the day that Lucy was actually murdered, he'd cycled to and from the flat in Curzon Court and he'd taken the straight route along Coxford Road. He'd said to the police that Lucy was obsessed with him. In fact, he even said that at one point she'd woken him up to see her standing over him and said that she'd follow him around the house, that she'd take his belongings. He went on to say that he'd even complained about it to her mother and said that she'd been really stalkerish. This is a kid and he's accusing her of being stalkerish. I mean, on what planet is the child capable of being a stalker? They're a kid. You can ground them. You can make them stay in the bedroom at that point. We're not talking somebody out there going around figuring out your digital footprint and following you to work, are we? But this is what he's doing. He's trying to create that I'm the victim in this circumstance. I've spoken to Lucy's mother about this because it was a problem for me. Even went on to say that basically Lucy had threatened to tell her mum that he'd got her pregnant in the days before her death. Now, if you are an investigator and you hear that from the lips of a grown-ass man, all you're going to think is, you've been abusing that kid. You're the person who's a threat here. You've told her mum potentially that she's been stalking you, taking belongings from your room, but you've done that to make her look like she's a little bit unhinged as a kid, going through some adolescent phase. And essentially, he, of course, will believe that deflects attention. It doesn't deflect attention. It absolutely homes in on him as a potential perpetrator. Now, you add to that the idea that she's saying to him allegedly that he's got her pregnant and she's going to lie about it and say that this has happened when it hasn't. That's a massive red flag, and I imagine the coppers knew straight away. You are the perpetrator. You've done this to protect yourself. Now, he denies any involvement in a killing, of course he does. He also denies any sexual activity with her, but if you just put it together in the context of we've had two schools concerned about the fact that they believe he was in a sexual relationship with her. We've had friends hear about this and be concerned. We've had one friend actually action this, tell parents, get parents to speak to her parents. Now we can add he's telling her own mother that she's infatuated with him, and now he's telling the police, I never had sex with her, I didn't get her pregnant, she was threatening me. We have got too many commonalities within this situation all around sex with this little girl. Yes, he's denying it, but there's too much consistency within the reality of this theme arising again and again and again. We get to the 31st of July 2018. The police say, listen, we need your social media passwords because obviously you've got absolutely nothing to hide. He refuses. At this point, is it possible that we just avoid the case entirely and just put him straight in prison? I'm thinking the highest security prison. I'm thinking, is there a prison specifically for psychopathic serial killers and sex offenders who are strong, aggressive and non-reformed and will be in prison forever? And if so, is it possible that he could share a cell with one of those, maybe with his boa constrictor? Maybe we could just leave him in a cell empty with a boa constrictor and not feed the boa constrictor for a while. Just see what happens. Anyway, apparently that's not the legal system in the UK. I've just gone into one of my fantasies there about what should happen. Because you know what? You should not be allowed to actually refuse to give your social media passwords when we are dealing with the murder of a child. This is why I can kind of comprehend that certain levels of torture were administered back in the day. I know it's not acceptable. I know there are human rights. But you know, the odd thumbscrew, if you're refusing to give me the information that I need to get into your social media, just as a potential reality, unless you do, just saying, might be a way from get to A to B quite quickly. Anyway, they keep investigating this murder and the police are obviously absolutely convinced now that they're dealing with the murderer. And this means that they go out of their way to establish the true movements that he made that day. And this actually used groundbreaking technology at the time. It was new. So they used data from the cloud. And that data from the cloud was associated to the location data from Nicholson's Samsung mobile phone. Now, despite the fact that that phone hadn't actually been located, it did actually get discovered like months later. And he'd hidden it in his brother's locker at work. I just want to throw it out there. How do you hide anything in your brother's locker at work without your brother finding it? Genuinely. Is it just me? Is it just me who's a little bit old-fashioned? But if I was at work, you know, getting my little dinner out with my Kit Kat, my bag of crisps, my sandwich, whatever it is, and I'm like, you know, shuffling around as you do in a locker, because they're not very big, and I suddenly find a Samsung phone, I'm not going to be like, oh, somebody's left me a little Samsung phone gift. I'm going to be like, whose is this Samsung phone? And could it potentially be needed in an investigation around the murder of a child? Sorry, I have no evidence to say that his brother knew it was there, but I'm just saying. When did lockers get so big that it's like friggin' Narnia? Because that's the only type of locker you might not notice a phone in. Anyway, when they look at this data regarding the location, etc., it turns out he hadn't taken the straight route along Coxford Road as he'd claimed. He'd actually detoured from his usual route and he'd gone down through Tanner's Brook. That's a mile from the murder scene. The police are obsessed with this case. They are not letting him get away with it. And again, you guys know that if the police screw up in any way, shape or form, I am the first to go through every single mistake and to call it out. But also when they really work damn hard to make sure that somebody is brought to justice, it's so important that we remember that. They did the most painstaking fingertip search of Tanner's Brook. Really, really painstaking. And when we say fingertip search, we mean there are lines of police officers and they are literally going through every little sheet of grass to find whatever it is they can to create justice for this lost child. It's the largest ever carried out in the UK. That was on the 30th of August 2018. It's just a month after Lucy had been killed. And they find what they were looking for. They actually spend that time and all of those officers, and it bears fruit. They find a partially burnt Tesco bag, and inside it, rolled up, they find bloodstained clothing. And the police suspected that that was Nicholson's murder kit. Clothing that he'd taken from that flat at Curzon Court and actually worn to kill Lucy. It included a blood-stained blue hoodie with blood-stained surgical gloves in the pocket. And then when they did subsequent forensic testing, they were able to identify Lucy's DNA on the actual clothing together with Nicholson's DNA. Bang, two rights. When they did the fibre analysis, that also linked into the clothing. And the police built up what they believed happened, which is, as I've described, that he would have lured Lucy to her death by exchanging messages with her and convincing her that she should go there. And once she'd arrived, he basically carried out this execution-style killing. Now imagine being that kind of stone-cold killer. You're waiting for this child, a little girl, who thinks potentially she's coming to make up with you or to forgive you or to move forward in a direction where neither of you need to be angry with one another, and essentially you can let go of the past and all those things that could be the potential outcomes of this moment. And actually she walks up there and he's had a lot of time to not go through with this, but this is how cold, calculating, a stone cold killer this man really is. She walks up there probably smiling, probably expecting some kind of nice interchange of communication, an exchange of progress and an exchange of hope. And he's just waiting for her, kill kit in hand, dressed in clothes he's styled that he can let go of and get rid of. And he's gonna take the life of this gorgeous little girl. And I use the term little girl for good reason, because she is just 13 years of age. This man has been raping her for a year, and he feels he's got the right to execute her in this way. After he kills Lucy, he makes this detour back to Tanner's Brook. This is where he's caught on CCTV. That's at the sports centre, and he's cycling towards Tanner's Brook and he's clutching this plastic Tesco bag that we now know is containing the clothing stains with Lucy's blood. Then he dumped the bag deep in the bushes, it's beside a stream, and he'd actually attempted to burn it. Now, of course, Nicholson's trying to think on his feet because the police have got him banged to rights on video, etc. So he's now trying to talk about the fact that, well, yeah, I did make a detour to Tanner's Brook, but I'd only gone there to buy cannabis. Did you? Because didn't you tell the police that you got rid of your phone because you didn't want to implicate any of your dealers? So what, have you just got some kind of like savant brain that's going on and remembering all of these things, such as your dealer's telephone number that you no longer have because you've dumped the phone? Even though you've got this capacity to remember these kind of details, you haven't got the capacity to actually tell the police about these detours before they have to find out and face you with it. I mean, just throwing it out there. Story's falling apart a little bit, isn't it? So he just denies any of the knowledge of these bloody clothes. He has no idea how the DNA's ended up on there. I would love to be in this situation where you're interrogating this kind of individual. Just let me get this straight. So what you're saying is that you have no idea how these bloody clothes of yours with your DNA and Lucy's DNA ended up in the area that we saw you cycling with a Tesco bag that's a Tesco bag essentially that's attempted to be burnt. Yeah, I did. I've no idea really. Hang on a minute. Let me just think about this. Yes, I do have an idea. I don't know who those clothes are or anything to do with what you've just said regarding the fibres and the blood. That's got nothing to do with me, even though it's specifically my DNA and her DNA. But what I can say is that it was because I was just going past with a Tesco bag with a meal deal in it because you get hungry after smoking cannabis, and I wanted to go and score some cannabis. That's why I took the detour. How did you call your cannabis dealer? With my phone. You didn't have a phone. You said that you got rid of it because you had the dealer's numbers on you, didn't want to incriminate them. It's a fair point, but I have the uncanny ability to remember dealers' phone numbers. I'm just going to get a phone. Can you ring him now? Yeah, can you ring the dealer now? Because obviously you can remember it. I have this really weird condition that's actually caused by an incident with a boa constrictor where it choked me out, and I've lost some memory, so I'm not going to be able to do that for you. We're going to send you to prison forever, and we're going to find a cell that's very small and very damp and has a serial killer in it just for you. Again, a little bit of a fantasy there. That didn't happen. But in my head, that's what would have preferably happened. But yeah, he's just denying it. No idea what you're on about. Nothing to do with me. And another thing that he did was he burned the trainers he'd been wearing when he killed her. So he basically burnt these on a bonfire. And again, data from his phone was very forthcoming, and it confirmed he'd performed a Google search on the day of the murder. In fact, he'd written, "What time is good to start a bonfire?" So it's so incriminating. Now, of course, Nicholson's got another excuse, and again, outlandish and bizarre. So he says to the police, yeah, I did burn my trainers, but the reason I burned my trainers was because they'd split whilst cleaning out my mother's shed, which I was going to house my reptiles in because obviously I needed a new home for them. Said no sane person ever. I mean, mums, dads out there, if we're not setting fire to our little darling shoes every other Friday, I don't know what we're doing. Because as you know, when your child comes home with a scuff or a split or the sole's hanging off a little bit, it's an instant reality, isn't it? Oh no, little Johnny's trainers have got a slight split in them. I'll just go and make sure that I stoke the bonfire outside. In fact, I have a bonfire permanently because it's the only way to dispose of these kind of implements and issues, isn't it? Anything that's a little bit wonky, broken or split, we throw on the fire. Honestly, unbelievable. But anyway, this is what he says. Obviously, when you split your shoes, you don't throw them away, you just burn them. Police believe that he got rid of his mobile phone, of course, and changed his Facebook account password, all because he was trying to throw them off the scent. But all it did was put the scent directly onto him, because clearly everything he's saying is absolute garbage. Literally. Lucy was brighter than this man. She had more brain cells in her fingertip, and fingertips don't have brain cells. I think we can all agree the kind of level this individual is operating at. But he's trying to get away with it. He has no intention of taking responsibility. This is not an individual with any level of remorse. He doesn't care about the actions. Now, investigators have obviously got loads of evidence, all the evidence, in fact, that they need on Nicholson. But it gets even better, because a 22-year-old woman contacts the police. So this woman's been following the news, she's seen the coverage of Lucy's murder, and she just instantly realises who Nicholson is. And she even recognises the place where Lucy's body's been found. So in 2014, she was just 14 years of age when this happened. And bear in mind, at this point, Nicholson was 18. She and a friend had gone to Nicholson's tattoo parlour. Now, bear in mind, you're not allowed a tattoo if you're under 18 in the UK, but of course, Nicholson doesn't care about boundaries, particularly when there's two young girls involved. I mean, that's the particular type of individual he's attracted to, so he's not going to say no when they want a tattoo. So despite obviously being underage, he'd agreed to give her a tattoo. They get chatting because he's kind of followed up with her online, and the messages take on exactly what you'd imagine. They become more and more flirtatious, and ultimately he then asks her to have sex with him as part payment for her tattoo. Now, she agrees to this. I mean, we all know it wasn't because it was part payment for the tattoo. She was probably quite flattered. He paid her attention, and she probably thought it was a bit naughty, so she felt a bit bolstered when there came the opportunity to only pay for a little bit of her tattoo, and so that's used as an excuse, but really he's just groomed her. It's as simple as that. He's groomed her. So first of all, he takes her to the flats at Curzon Court, and wow, she is great. So she's really able to describe in absolute detail the property, and that's really important because obviously it lends weight to her experience. It lends weight to her credibility. She said it'd been really dirty, there were piles of old clothes, there were papers, magazines everywhere. And she said then he took her into the woods at Tanner's Brook, and that's where they'd had sex. And she literally took the officers to the exact spot where that had happened 6 years earlier. And that spot turned out to be just 50 metres from where Lucy was murdered. Now, of course, Nicholson denies everything again, but her testimony is just absolutely compelling. And again, what is going through that loser's mind? This is the girl who has nothing to do with the flat at Curzon Road, and yet she's able to describe in detail exactly what he was like. So she's able to describe the environment that you would only be able to describe if you had been there. At the end of the day, she's got no relationship to that place, but she can intimately describe exactly what it was like. So again, his denials just fall on deaf ears at this point. When it comes down to the plea, of course, Nicholson pleaded not guilty because he couldn't care less about her poor mum. He couldn't care less about the family members who've lost that beautiful girl. All he wants is to try and get away with it. And we all know when you plead not guilty, then your sentence is going to be sterner when you are found guilty. And that kind of warms my heart. His arrogance, his narcissism, his superiority, his predatory nature. He can't believe that Lucy's going to wield power over him through death. Because that's the irony, isn't it? He was afraid of her in life. He was afraid that potentially she could tell somebody that she could ruin his freedom, that she could steal his life because his actions are so reprehensible, but he doesn't take any responsibility for it. So as far as he's concerned, she is somebody who could literally wield that power over him and impact on him. And yet, wow, from death, she's beyond powerful, because now he's caught in the headlights of justice and the law and reality. He's caught in retribution. So Lucy may not be breathing in this dimension. And yes, she's had her future stolen by this reprehensible excuse for a human being, but she is mighty and she is powerful in this moment. The case goes to trial. Obviously, that's terrible for her family. It commences on the 18th of June 2019. It starts at Winchester Crown Court. The prosecution rightly claim that Nicholson had systematically abused, sexually exploited this vulnerable girl for a year. And they said that when she'd falsely claimed that she was pregnant, because obviously she's been dealing with him being highly inappropriate and aggressive, and she's tried to take the power back a little bit, although we wish that she had realised the man had this kind of level of criminal form. She didn't, she was a kid. But obviously that's all she could do at the time. She was scaring him with the only thing she could scare him with. And that was the motivation, that he'd feared being exposed. So then he thought, no, you're not taking the power back. And that's when he'd carefully planned the murder before cold-bloodedly luring her to her death and executing her in Woodland. And it takes till the 18th of July 2019. It's after a month's trial, after 8 hours of deliberation, The jury unanimously found Nicholson guilty of Lucy's murder. Of course he was found guilty. It was always going to play out that way. But this guy, he was so delusional and narcissistic that without a doubt, he would have imagined that he could have manipulated the jury in the court. Just as he'd manipulated that 14-year-old girl to have sex with him when he tattooed her. Just as he manipulated and sexually abused Lucy. Just as he manipulated Lucy's family to taking him in. This is a guy who thinks that he can just say things and it will work out for him. He has no conscience, no consequential thinking, and no understanding of just how people feel when somebody steals the life of a child. I imagine the jury just felt thrilled when that verdict of guilty was read out. We get to the 25th of July 2019. This is a year after murdering Lucy, and Nicholson's sentenced. Judge Mrs. Justice May outlined the many aggravating factors in this case. So first and foremost, Lucy was really vulnerable because she was so young. And also the fact that he had been involved in a sexual relationship with her prior to the murder when she was still a child. So he was exploiting her in that way and abusing her that way. Also, there was clear evidence, wasn't there, that the actual murder had been premeditated. So Nicholson had lured Lucy into a trap. He'd taken a weapon to the murder scene. He tried to dispose of the evidence afterwards. It's so obvious that when you look at the injuries that she suffered, he'd fully intended to kill her. He hadn't just wanted to cause her harm or to warn her. And when it came to mitigating circumstances, none were identified, literally none. So massive list as to why the murder was so heinous, none introduced to excuse the crime to a certain degree, because there was no excuse. That guy deserves to burn in hell right now. You know, that bonfire that he used for his trainers? Just throwing it out there. Now, 25-year-old Nicholson ends up getting sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 33 years. 33 years is a pretty steep sentence in the UK, but genuinely, when you think about this kind of killer, in my mind, I just think a full life tariff is what he should be facing. When you think about his prior activities criminally, he's a very violent, very malevolent soul, and I just don't think a million years in jail would ever counter the mindset that he carries with him. That's one of the things about the American system. They would actually give somebody a million years in jail just to kind of cement what a grotesque individual that they are. You know what's ironic about this guy? This worthless piece of scum. He has the word freedom tattooed above his right eye. Yeah. I bet when he looks in the mirror at that on a daily level in prison, it really kind of pangs, you know? Because when it comes down to it, for 33 years, Lucy is going to wield power over him and he won't have any freedom. And who knows what can happen in that kind of time. He also got found guilty of 3 counts of rape against Lucy when she was 12 and was also found guilty of sexual activity against the other 14-year-old girl back in 2012. And I'm glad that she got validated. I'm glad that it was noted that she could not consent either. It's as simple as that, and that he exploited her also. One of the things that, to some degree, I understand, because people feel so broken and so angered when a child is murdered in this way, because we care deeply about our most vulnerable, we really do. But sometimes that can lead to actions that are not positive. And when Lucy died, her family were apparently bombarded with abuse from loads of vigilante groups. And to put it in context, police actually had to be stationed outside the family home. Her mum became really afraid to leave the house, even to visit her daughter's grave. Her stepfather, he got attacked outside a convenience store in Millbrook and he needed hospital treatment for a broken elbow. And it turns out that the 2 men who did that, they actually were charged with inflicting GBH. One of the guys actually filmed the attack. And like I said, the motivation behind that comes from a place of rage because a child has been killed. People were no doubt angry at the fact that they invited Lucy's killer to live in their home and that they failed to spot the abuse that had been ongoing for a year. And obviously they also ignored the concerns from her schools and friends. And that is something that on reflection, I'm sure is a burden that is almost unbearable to carry. But we can all agree that at no point did they believe that this man who they invited into their own home was going to heinously murder their child. That just doesn't make sense. They made mistakes. I believe that they will own and know and live and breathe those mistakes from moment to moment, minute to minute, every day for the rest of their lives. But they aren't the perpetrator. Failures, yes, but they aren't the perpetrator. And the fact that people are so angry and want to be really retribution orientated towards the family, that isn't going to solve the problem. The person who needs to suffer in this, he's in prison. And I hope to God he's suffering day in, day out, with every breath he takes. The family, they have to live with what they did and failed to do for the rest of their lives. And I do genuinely think that means that they've been punished enough. And I do know that if they could go back and change the outcome of this, they would change the outcome of this in a heartbeat. Because not even in their worst nightmares or their most dismissive of moments could they ever have anticipated the horror that that poor little girl was going to endure, and the horror that that excuse for a human being was capable of. The one person to blame in this scenario, a murderer, a child molesting paedophile, a man who's now serving a life sentence, that's who we have to blame. And all I can hope is that the inmates remind him of his crimes on a daily basis, every single day, for the next 33 years. That's what I wish for. And as I said, whilst that little girl couldn't wield the power over him in life, my God, she's wielded it in death. I hope you found this particular case interesting. I hope you feel that justice has been done to a point. Obviously, when I have a lot of American viewers, there is a real sense of injustice because you will literally incarcerate an individual forever. And I actually really connect with that, particularly on cases like this. But in the UK, that is a relatively stern sentence. And hey, a lot can happen in 33 years. A lot of bad things do happen in prison. It certainly won't be a picnic for a violent offender like him. As ever, it's very easy when there is a brutal murder like this to concentrate on this little girl's end. But I also think we should concentrate on what her mum said about her, that she was nicknamed the brain because she was so bright and quick-witted, that she had the energy that so many of us would envy, that she always took time out for everybody else, and it was never a no if people needed help. That speaks to a beautiful soul. And like I said, we should never, ever forget the life fully lived. That's what really has meaning here. It was short, but it was purposeful, it was beautiful, and no matter what he stole in those final moments, it just doesn't dim Lucy's light. Thank you for joining me, guys. I'll see you again. Wednesdays and Sundays, I always share my content, and as I always say, guys, be safe, take care, and this is absolutely dedicated to Lucy. Fly high, sweetheart.